At minus 28 degrees, a winter night in the high valleys of the American Rockies becomes something more than cold. It becomes a kind of pressure, a force that squeezes through every seam of a poorly built cabin until even the living feel brittle. This night had already taken far too much from the Harper family: warmth, comfort, strength, and nearly hope. And now it was coming for the last of those too. Snow blew sideways across the ridge, carried by 40-55 mpsr gusts that scraped the cabin walls like claws testing for weakness. The structure, built in the proud style of eastern frontier homes, stood tall, straight, exposed, and utterly unsuited for the kind of winter the mountains were known to deliver. Tall walls meant tall drafts. Proud roofs meant proud heat loss. And every hour the temperature fell, the fire inside the Harper cabin lost just a little more of its power to fight back. Inside, a single lantern flickered in the stale air, unable to decide if it wanted to burn bright or collapse into darkness. The logs in the hearth spat wet sparks. The wood was freezing faster than it was burning. The walls themselves were rimmed with frost. Maria Harper wrapped another blanket around her youngest child, but the fibers were already cold. A thin shimmer of ice dusted the boys' eyebrows. Their fire had been burning since afternoon. Still, the cabin hovered just barely above freezing. As the wind drove needles of cold through the gaps in the logs, the heat slipped away upward and outward. No matter how much wood they fed into the flames, the truth remained the same. They were losing the war with the winter. Jonathan Harper, sturdy, tired, and beaten down, knelt before the fire, rubbing his hands in wary circles, as if friction alone could summon the warmth the timber refused to give. He had grown up in the milder eastern woodlands, where cabins stood tall and proud, and winters bit but rarely tore. Here the mountains played by different rules, and cabins like theirs, built for height and stance, stood no chance against a wind that happily reached inside and took what it pleased. The door rattled violently. Snow dust burst through the edges, collecting in a thin white ridge on the floorboards. Maria flinched. The children tightened their blankets. Jonathan moved to reinforce the door with another beam. Each step felt heavier than the last, whether from cold or despair, he couldn't tell. Another gust slammed into the cabin. The supporting post shuddered. A corner joint popped sharply, the sound echoing like the breaking of a brittle bone. He froze. If the storm pried even one major seam open, the drafts would become torrents, and then no fire on earth could keep that cabin warm. He put his ear to the wall. Could he hear it? The faint cracking? The wood fibers bending under ice load? Yes, he could. And the night was still young. Outside, the world was a sheet of white chaos. The storm, the kind that ate entire weeks of fuel, roared through the buh. Valley below, visibility had shrunk to nearly nothing. The snow line had blurred into the sky so completely that even the treetops seemed to vanish. Jonathan whispered to Maria. "We should have had enough wood." Her reply was hoarse. "Maybe if it warms after midnight." But they both knew mountain storms didn't soften with time. They pressed harder, colder, more relentless until dawn proved if a family's preparations had been enough. Tonight, the Harpers were not. By the hearth, the children huddled so closely they looked like a single trembling shadow. Their breath plumed out in thin gray clouds. Not warm breath, barely warmer than the air around them. Jonathan forced himself to walk to the fire again. Knees stiff, fingers numb. He reached for the last 3 logs. Each one precious. Each one a reduction in the hours they could survive. Outside, the wind shrieked like a living thing, furious that the cabin still stood. He set one log into the coals. Sparks leapt, then died. Then, over the storm, came something else. A sound so faint he almost dismissed it. A shuffle. A step. But impossibly steady, impossibly calm for a night like this. Jonathan turned toward the window, but the frost layer made the outside world a blur of ghostly shapes. Another step, closer. He gripped the handle of his hatchet, not in fear, but in disbelief. No one would be out in this weather, not unless they were hunting warmth just as desperately as the Harpers were. The wind softened for half a breath, just enough to hear a soft thump on the porch. Maria drew the children close. Jonathan moved toward the door. A silhouette passed the window, and then another thump, not knocking, not begging, just announcing. Jonathan opened the door with effort. Wind blasted inward. Snow swirled. His hat flew backward. and in the center of that blizzard stood a figure wrapped in a heavy hide cloak, thick with snow mold, head bowed slightly, as if listening to something the storm was saying. The man lifted his face. A Shoshone elder, deep lines carved from years of mountain life, a gaze steady and unafraid. Jonathan stood speechless, hand frozen mid-air. The elder stepped inside with quiet authority, shutting the door behind him. Snow fell from his cloak in soft clumps. The storm faded to a muffled growl. The elder scanned the cabin once, walls shaking, frost climbing, children wrapped in fear, and said in a low, calm voice, "This house fights the wind. You cannot win that fight." Jonathan swallowed. "We built it strong." The elder shook his head. "Tall walls lose warmth. High roofs lose warmth. Winter here rewards what holds the earth." He knelt by the hearth, passing his hand through the weak flame, feeling how quickly the heat fled upward. Then he stood and looked Jonathan directly in the eye. "If you stay in this cabin, the cold will take your children. No anger, no fear. Just truth delivered with the certainty of someone who had watched many winters claim many lives." Jonathan's voice cracked. "Then what do we do?" The elder pointed toward the storm. "There is a way. It is old. It is proven. It uses the earth itself. If you wish your family to see the next moon, come with me at first light." Maria clutched her children. Jonathan nodded, and the elder said one final line before the wind drowned the world again. "The mountain will warm you if you build in its skin." If a single night could decide whether a frontier family lived or froze, would you want to know the one survival method that could save them? Then keep watching, because the mountains are about to reveal it. The storm eased just enough for dawn light to seep through the frost-coated window, a pale blue glow that revealed how close the Harpers had come to freezing in the night. Jonathan moved stiffly, each step cracking a thin crust of ice on the floorboards. Maria held the children near the weak fire, their breaths visible in long, slow streams. The cabin was barely warmer than the world outside, but the elder, the Shoshone visitor who had arrived like an answer, whispered through the storm, sat near the hearth with the steadiness of someone who had survived more brutal winters than the Harpers could imagine. His heavy hide cloak steamed lightly as ice melted from its edges. He had slept without complaint, without fear, and without the worry that haunted every breath the family took. Jonathan studied him in the half-light. The man's face, lined by decades of mountain winters, looked carved from the same stone cliffs that towered above the valley. His eyes were clear and alert. The cold had not touched him the way it tortured the Harper children. Jonathan finally asked quietly, "How were you out there last night?" The elder opened his hands to the fire. "The wind bites, but only those who stand above it suffer." A riddle, Jonathan thought, or perhaps a lesson. The elder pointed with two fingers, slowly, deliberately, first to the logs of their cabin wall, then to the snow-drifted hillside beyond the window. "You built high, proud." He tapped the wall. "Shoshone built low, quiet." Maria looked confused. "But wouldn't that be colder?" "No." The elder shook his head. "The earth holds warmth. Even frozen, it holds it. The wind cannot take what it cannot reach." The words felt heavy, ancient, carrying both simplicity and depth Jonathan had not expected. He knew the Shoshone had survived these mountains long before settlers ever imagined crossing them, but he had never considered that their shelter itself, its shape, its placement, its conversation with the land, was a survival technique as old as the valleys. He sat across from the elder, humbled. "What should we have done?" The elder reached into the soot near the hearth and drew a shape with a charcoal black fingertip. Not a cabin, not a tent, something between a den and a hut, a half-circle pressed into the earth, small, low, pretty protected. Then he drew the wind as long sweeping strokes. They passed cleanly over the structure. He tapped the drawing. "This one listens to the mountain." He tapped the tall cabin sketch. "This one fights it." Jonathan felt heat rise in his face, not from the fire, but from shame. They had worked so hard on their cabin, believing height meant safety, believing the valley winters would behave as the ones they had known elsewhere. Maria leaned in. "How much warmer would that earth shelter be?" The elder wiped the soot with his palm, creating a clean surface. Then he drew an hour. 20 to 35 degrees, sometimes more. Jonathan's heart stuttered. 30 degrees. That difference meant the edge between holding life and losing it. He whispered, "You're telling me the ground is warmer than the air?" "No." The elder smiled faintly, the smallest flicker of humor warming the room. I'm telling you, the air out there is your enemy. The earth is patient. It releases heat slowly, and slowly as life in winter. He pointed to the floor. 2 or 3 feet down, even in cold moons, the earth sleeps near freezing, not death cold like the wind. Build with it, lean into it, let it shield you, and your fire will finally have a home. Jonathan ran a hand through his hair. All this time they'd been fighting the mountain with the wrong kind of shelter. Maria's voice wavered. Could you teach us? Could you show us how to build it? The elder nodded once. At first light. He stood, joints quiet despite age, and moved toward the door. He opened it just a crack. Snow pushed inward, but the storm had softened, its rage now a steady breath instead of a scream. He looked toward the ridge. The wind will change by midday. A harder storm comes behind it. You have little time. Jonathan swallowed. How long do we have? The elder paused. Maybe one day? Maybe less. Maria clutched the children closer. Then why help us? Jonathan asked softly. We came here. Took land that wasn't ours. Why help us now? The elder closed the door gently, turned, and looked Jonathan in the eye with a calm that seemed older than the valley itself. Cold does not care who you are, he said. Winter is an old teacher. It kills those who do not listen. I have seen too many cabins fall, too many fires die. Your children deserve to live another moon. He took a piece of charcoal and sketched again in the ash, this time showing layers. The hillside, a hollow carved into it, snow piled at the sides, a roof set low, a fire at the back, an entrance angled away from the prevailing wind. Maria leaned closer. It looks like it's part of the ground. It is, the elder replied. Wind flows over, snow shelters it, heat stays inside. It is simple, 'cause winter is simple. Jonathan felt something shift inside him. Respect, gratitude, and fear. Fear of what might happen if they failed to build this in time. The elder brushed off his hands and stood straight. Gather tools. We go when the light grows. Maria looked toward the window. It's still so cold. Cold will follow you, the elder said. Better to meet it while your strength still holds. He wrapped his cloak around his shoulders, tied a leather cord across his chest, and stepped toward the door once again. Before leaving, he spoke a final truth that settled deep into Jonathan's bones. The winter does not forgive what people do not know. Then, with a nod that held both warning and promise, he stepped outside into the pale dawn. The first light of the day came slow, pale, and cold, nothing more than a thin ribbon of blue stretching across the horizon. It was the kind of dawn where even the sky seemed frozen. The Harper family stepped outside behind the Shoshone elder, their breath drifting upward in long, trembling plumes. 30 degrees, the kind of cold that made eyelashes stiffen and wooden handles bite through gloves. Yet the elder moved with the unhurried confidence of someone who had walked this valley in 100 winters. He paused a few paces from the cabin and looked across the ridge, watching how the wind traced the snow. His cloak lifted in gentle folds, responding to currents the Harpers couldn't see. Jonathan followed his gaze. What are you looking for? The elder pointed. Where the mountain shelters itself. Maria frowned. Shelters itself? He nodded. The wind tells us where warmth can survive. He crouched, letting snow spill through his fingers. The Harpers gathered around as he began clearing a small patch of frozen soil with slow, careful movements. He brushed aside snow until the earth showed beneath, dark, cold, but not deadly. We build here, he said, on the leeward side, where the wind bends and leaves the ground untouched. Jonathan rubbed his hands for warmth. Why not closer to the cabin? The elder pressed his palm to the exposed earth. Because this hillside is facing away from the storm path. Your cabin stands in the wind's teeth. Here, he pressed deeper. Here the mountain breathes. A simple sentence, yet Jonathan felt the weight of a lesson hidden within it. They had built high and proud, where a man could see far. But the Shoshone built where the land offered shelter without asking. The elder stood in motion toward the ridge. Look. The Harpers followed his gesture. Snow was piled deep on the windward side, banked and driven hard, but the slope just below the ridge had only a thin layer, soft and still. The wind broke above it and passed overhead without digging into the hillside. Here, the elder said, the wind forgets to bite. He walked down a few steps, his boots sinking lightly. And the earth, 2 feet beneath your feet holds 32 to 38 degrees, even in the cold moon. Jonathan blinked. You're saying the soil is warmer than the air? Always, the elder said simply. Air dies in cold. Earth endures. He picked up a stick and drew in the snow, a curved back wall pressed into the hillside, a floor sunk to an atoll of 1 feet below the surface, a roof pitched low, almost hugging the earth, thick layers of packed snow and burned soil around the sides, a single entrance angled away from the valley winds. The design looked nothing like a frontier cabin. It looked older, more instinctive, more right. The elder's finger paused on the sunken floor. This traps still air, the warms. He moved to the berm walls. These hold heat. Snow is not only cold, it is also a blanket. He tapped the low roof, and here the weight of winter makes the shelter tighter, not weaker. Jonathan knelt to study the drawing. How much warmer would this stay? Truly? The elder shrugged lightly, as if the answer were so obvious it barely needed speaking. Sighed. 15 to 30 degrees warmer without fire. Maria's eyes widened. She pressed her hand to her mouth, imagining warmth like that. Real warmth, not the thin, brittle heat that leaked from their cabin every time a new gust struck the walls. But how? She asked. Why would being lower make such a difference? The elder took a moment before answering. He scooped a handful of snow and packed it firmly, creating a small block. Then he placed it on the soil and pressed gently. When the wind hits your cabin, he said, patting the top of the snow block, it takes heat every moment. It strips it. It steals it. He lifted the block and set it against the hillside. But when we build with the land, the wind cannot take what it cannot reach. The mountain shields, the soil stores. He stood, letting the snow fall from his hands. Tall walls lose heat. Low walls keep it. You do not need to fight winter. You must deny it the things it steals. Jonathan felt foolish all over again. Everything the settlers built here had been shaped by memories of the East, the log cabins of forests with softer winters, where height meant pride and safety. But this land played by older rules. The elder placed his hand on the hillside. This is where Shoshone lived through the cold moon. Earth shelters have saved many families. They can save yours. Maria stepped forward, touching the soil. It felt muted. Not warm, but not viciously cold like the wind-beaten ground above. Feels different, she whispered. The elder nodded. This is the mountain's skin, not the wind's. He turned his attention to the Harpers, measuring their strength, their fear, their determination. To build this, you must trust what you do not yet understand. Jonathan nodded, jaw tight. We'll do it. Maria inhaled deeply. All of us. The elder gave a single approving nod. We begin by digging, only a little, enough to let the cold rise above you instead of crushing you. He showed them where to mark the shelter's outline, an oval pressed into the slope, its back wall merging naturally with the earth. Simple, practical, efficient. A structure designed by centuries of listening instead of resisting. As they dug, the elder spoke between breaths. The earth does not freeze the same way the air freezes. Down a little, below frost, warmth sleeps. You build into that sleep. Then, he lifted a handful of soil. You ask the land to hold heat for you. Jonathan paused, struck by the strange elegance of the method. A shelter that didn't merely hide from winter, but partnered with the land to survive it. The elder continued marking measurements. 2.5 feet, not deeper, not shallower. This depth takes warmth from the earth and keeps cold from the air. Maria brushed snow from her hair. How did your people learn this? The elder's eyes softened, gazing across the valley. By watching. By failing. By watching again. Winter teaches those who listen. Winter destroys those who do not. He rested his hand on the hillside one final time. And this is one that had taught us long ago. The elder didn't wait for formal weather instruments. He read clouds in wind-like language. A low, fast-moving bank to the west. A sharp turn in the wind's tone, the way crows flew low and silent. He warned them there was a 36-hour blizzard closing from the high pass, one that would bury roofs and cut off trails. They had less than a day to change everything. There was no time for long theory. The work began in the flat, efficient rhythm of people who knew the simplest way to turn a hill into shelter. Dig, berm, roof, seal, and ventilate. The Harpers had axes and a long-handled shovel. The elder brought direction, short bone-handled spades, and a practiced eye for measurement. This was indigenous survival expressed as a concise construction plan. Traditional skills turned into a survival technique under pressure. First, layout and excavation. They marked an oval roughly 10 to 12 feet long by 8-9 feet wide, with the long axis running parallel to the lee of the hill. The back wall would merge into the slope. The floor would be dug 2.5 feet below the surrounding ground. This depth, the elder said, strikes the balance, deep enough to reach the Earth's stable thermal zone, but shallow enough to dig quickly and to keep fresh air reachable. 5 people working with mixed tools, settler axes and shovels, elders' spades and strong hands, could excavate that volume in roughly 6 to 9 hours in cold, efficient shifts. The elder timed the work. Dig in the morning, finish the berm before the first wind change at dusk. They threw the excavated soil forward and used it to form the berm, a compacted bank on 3 sides, packed in layers. Each layer was tamped down hard until it felt like a living wall. The berms were built 2 to 3 feet thick around the sides and back, and sloped gently outward so the snow would pile against them and press them tighter. Snow, the elder reminded them, is not only weight. When packed, it becomes insulating, an old and counterintuitive form of blanket. Second, structure and framing. They set stout poles, timber cut from nearby lodgepole pines, into the cut floor at a low pitch. The roof was kept shallow, a low-angle pitch between 10 dig or 20 dig, almost hugging the hillside, sized to hold snow instead of shedding all of it. A higher roof would invite wind and lose heat. A low roof invites the snow to clamp down and seal. Crossbeams were lashed with rawhide and secured, so the roof span was small, no more than 8 feet, reducing the load each beam had to bear. They covered the beams in successive layers, first with woven branches and bark for structural separation, then with thick mats of reeds, grass, and hides, materials the Shoshone and the settlers could both supply. Finally, the roof was layered with a 6-12-inch bed of packed soil and snow, adding thermal mass. Third, entrance and airflow. Heat can escape faster through the open throat than the walls ever will allow it to, so the elder taught the crucial deal. Entrance detail. A low, narrow tunnel angled away from prevailing wind. They cut a tunnel roughly 6 to 8 feet long, starting low at 2.53 feet tall and no wider than 2.53 feet. This geometry forces cold air to lose momentum. It reduces pressure-driven drafts and traps warmer, still air inside the living chamber. The door, made of hide stretched over a wooden frame, was recessed behind the berm so wind gusts never struck it directly. An internal vestibule or airlock effect was created. One door, then a short low passage, then another curtain. Even a simple double-hide system reduces convective loss dramatically. The elder emphasized that a 3-foot-high entrance means people must bow to get in, an act of humility that also saves heat. Fourth, interior layout and sleeping platforms. Inside, they elevated sleeping platforms about 18 to 24 inches above the packed earth floor. The rationale: warm air rises to the higher still airspace beneath the low roof. Elevated platforms catch this pocket warmth and reduce dampness from the floor. Platforms were layered with thick mats, hides, and dried grass, traditional insulating goods that reflect and hold radiant heat. Fire placement was critical and conservative. A small controlled hearth set against the back wall, into the earth, provided radiant heat. The hearth's size was modest, a fire pit 18-24 inches across, enough to warm the air but small enough to limit fuel use and smoke. Smoke was channeled through a narrow flue in the roof that opened above the hearth. The elder designed it so that the flue could be partially closed to retain heat while maintaining enough draft to keep smoke from pooling. Fifth, ceiling and finish. Every seam was attended. Cracks between beams were packed with moss, grass, and animal hair, natural cork that would swell slightly with moisture and tighten. The outside berms were given a final tamp and then slushed with wet snow to create a surface crust that shed wind and locked in that packed insulation. Where possible, they added a layer of birch bark beneath the soil on the roof as a water barrier. Quantitative realities guided each choice. Packed berms, 2-3 foot thick, add substantial R-equivalent insulation compared to thin cabin walls. A low, 10-20 degrees roof reduces convective thermal pull. The entrance tunnel's length and low height cut convective losses by a significant fraction, practically halving the effective draft compared to a straight door. These are not mystical claims. They are practical, repeatable survival techniques proven across centuries of indigenous survival in cold regions. By late afternoon, as clouds began to thicken, the shelter's shell took form. The family was bone-tired, faces wind-burned and hands raw, but there was a quiet order to the labor, a choreography between newly learned traditional skills and the Harpers' willing muscle. Where their proud cabin had stood in opposition to the mountain, this new shelter became a conversation with it. The elder watched them pack the final layer of soil, then ran a hand across the berm. "Now we wait for the test," he said simply. They had built in one day what might otherwise have taken weeks, because the method was simple, the materials local, and the measurements time-proven. By nightfall, the sky had turned the color of hammered lead. The wind changed direction first, a subtle shift, but the elder felt it immediately. He paused, gaze narrowing at the ridgeline. "It comes early," he murmured. The clouds descended in thick, rolling sheets. Their speed told a truth only experienced winter watchers recognized. This wasn't just a storm. This was the kind of blizzard that forced the valley into silence for days, sometimes weeks. A storm that humbled cabins. A storm that tested every flaw in a man's preparation. Jonathan tightened the last hide flap over the tunnel entrance. Maria helped usher the children into the shelter's low opening. It was humbling to bow as they entered, but the elder had taught them that humility, lowering one's height, was the first step to surviving the winter. The wind followed those who stood tall. Those who bent toward the earth found mercy. Inside, the air held a muted stillness. The low roof pressed warmth downward, the domed walls blocked every gust, and the floor, packed and leveled, held a quiet coolness that wasn't hostile the way the cabin floor had felt. The fire pit glowed with a gentle, steady flame. Not large, not hungry, just enough. Outside, the first full blast of the blizzard struck the ridge. Snow swirled over the entrance, but the tunnel's angle kept the blast from entering. The elder tugged the hide door tight with a practiced motion, then settled by the hearth. Inside the earth-bermed shelter, the world was suddenly smaller, but safer. Jonathan breathed in and felt something unfamiliar. The room held warmth, not an abundance of it, but enough to ease the sting of the cold on his cheeks, enough to quiet the trembling in his hands. He lowered himself onto the elevated platform. Maria joined him, placing a palm against the packed earth wall. "It feels warmer," she whispered. "It is warmer," the elder replied. "The earth gives slowly, but it gives." A deep blast of wind rolled over the roof. The sound was different than it had been in the cabin. It was lower, muted. The snow that piled on the roof acted not as a threat but as an ally, pressing the roof structure tighter, sealing warmth in, blocking drafts. Jonathan closed his eyes and listened. Instead of the sharp rattling and popping that had plagued their cabin, the new shelter responded to the blizzard with a quiet, heavy calm, like a hibernating animal breathing under deep winter sleep. The wind grew more savage. Hail struck. Ice cracked on distant trees. Snow thickened into rolling white curtains. The temperature outside plunged to 31 degrees Celsius, but inside the shelter held at 22 to 28 degrees, warmer without the fire roaring. Maria adjusted a hide around her daughters. Their breathing steadied, their color returned, their shivering eased. And that was when Jonathan realized something truly staggering. "We're not losing heat," he said aloud, unable to believe it. "We're not losing any heat at all." The elder nodded. "This is why our shelters survive the cold moon." He took a small coal from the fire with a stone scoop and set it to the side for later use, conserving fuel with practiced efficiency. Jonathan studied the elder's quiet form. "Our cabin, it was wrong from the beginning, wasn't it?" "Not wrong," the elder said gently. "Just built for a different winter." Outside, another hammering gust slammed against the hillside, but this time the sound faded quickly, absorbed by the earth and snow. The shelter flexed slightly, alive, not rigid. Snow weight pressed it tighter into the slope. Everything the settlers had feared, a heavy load, a low roof, snow-packed walls, was exactly what the Shoshone had known would keep a family alive. Hours passed. The storm intensified. Night deepened into something dense and white. The blizzard swallowed the valley whole. The Harpers dozed in shifts, and for the first time since the winter began, they slept without fear. No draft slid across their faces. No icy air crawled beneath the blankets. The firewood pile, once consumed at alarming speed in the cabin, dwindled slowly now. They used 60–70% less wood than before. That fact alone meant survival. At one point, near midnight, Jonathan crawled to the entrance to feel the temperature differences. When he touched the hide flap, cold pushed faintly against it, but nowhere near the killing breath of the storm outside. Inside the shelter, the air stayed trapped, still warm. When he returned to the sleeping platform, Maria whispered, "Is it holding?" He took her hand and nodded. "Better than I ever imagined." The elder cracked open the flute slightly to release a pocket of smoke, then closed it again. He looked at Jonathan with an expression that was both teacher and guardian. "This is not magic," the elder said quietly. "It is listening. Wind moves one way, earth moves another. Fire wants a small room, not a large one. You build with these truths, or you suffer." A sudden crack outside echoed like a rifle shot. A tree somewhere uphill had snapped. Snow thundered in small slides across the ridge. The storm howled with a primal rage, but the shelter held. Inside, the fire cast small amber arcs along the walls. The earthen surface glowed softly in its warmth. The children slept through the roaring storm. Maria leaned her head on Jonathan's shoulder. The elder sat like carved stone, calm and watchful. And time passed, not in fear, but in survival. Hours later, when the storm reached its height, the elder spoke softly. "This is the trial. Everything you build must be tested by winter. Only then do you know if it is true," Jonathan whispered. "And is this true?" The elder listened to the wind beating harmlessly above them. Snow pressed down, thickening the roof, sealing it tighter. He nodded once. "Yes, this is true." When morning finally came, it arrived not with sunlight, but with a kind of silver quiet. The blizzard had spent itself in the night, emptying its fury across the valley and burying the world under a smooth, cold blanket. The wind had calmed to a gentle murmur. Snow lay high, piled against trees, over boulders, across rooftops that hadn't collapsed. Inside the earth-bermed shelter, the Harpers stirred slowly, warm in a way they had not experienced since before winter began. The fire had burned to gentle embers, but even without fresh wood, the interior temperature stayed stable. The earth was holding the night's heat, returning it in slow, steady breaths. Jonathan pushed aside the hide flap and crawled through the low entrance. A shimmer of white greeted him. Snow packed deep against the berm, but not blocking it. The angled tunnel had worked exactly as the elder said it would. He pushed through this final curtain and stood upright, squinting into the bright, silent morning. What he saw stole his breath. The valley below was a graveyard of failures. Cabins stood half-buried, their roofs bowed or broken. Smoke did not rise from many of them. Doors were blocked by drifts. Tall structures, proud against the sky, had taken the full force of the storm's crosswinds. Snowload had pressed downward, cracking rafters and collapsing beams built too high and too thin. The Harpers' old cabin, only 20 yards away, stood crooked. Snow had caved in half the roof. Frost coated the inside of its window. Even from the slope, Jonathan could tell no fire survived there. He felt Maria step out beside him. She covered her mouth with her hand. "Oh, Jonathan." The elder emerged last, brushing snow from his shoulders. His expression didn't change. He had expected this. He had seen it before, too many times. After a long silence, he said softly, "Your house was strong in the way of men who know forests, but not mountains." Jonathan swallowed. "We built what we knew." The elder nodded. "Yes, but winter here is older than what you knew." He walked to the edge of the slope and looked down at the broken rooftops. The sun caught the lines on his face, lines carved by decades of storms far worse than this one. His voice carried the calm weight of a lesson repeated for generations. Settlers come with tall walls and steep roofs. They learn these in places where storms come from above, not from the sides, where cold is sharp, not deep, where fire is heat enough. He crouched, scooping a handful of snow and letting it run through his fingers. But here, winter comes in ways your houses do not understand. Jonathan felt the truth of it. They had built a cabin to stand against the wilderness, never realizing the wilderness wasn't something to resist, it was something to work with. The elder continued, "Shoshone shelters are low because heat wants a small room. They are pressed into earth because the earth holds warmth when the air cannot. They use berms because thick walls remember the sun long after it sets. These are not tricks. These are truths." Maria stepped closer, listening intently. "Your people," the elder went on, "brought great things, tools, metal, trade goods, But they did not bring the memory of this land. They tried to make these valleys into the places they left behind. He looked at Jonathan with gentle sadness. Winter does not forgive that. Jonathan bowed his head. How many settlers have died this way? The elder answered with quiet honesty. Too many winters, too many families. Maria's hand moved to her heart, eyes heavy with grief. For their neighbors, for their own ignorance, for the stubborn pride that kept them from asking sooner. Jonathan forced himself to look at the broken cabins again. He saw families emerging slowly, struggling to dig themselves out, faces pale with cold, tools in shaking hands. Some were missing roofs entirely, some were missing smoke, and some were not coming out at all. The elder placed a hand on Jonathan's shoulder, firm, steady, grounding. You were lucky. You listened when the cold had not yet taken all your strength. Jonathan felt emotion knot in his chest. If we had known, none of this had to happen. Knowledge lives in the land, the elder said, but only those who listen find it. He stepped aside so the Harpers could take in the valley fully. The scene told a story older than the frontier itself, one of cultures meeting land with different memories, different lessons, different ways of surviving. The Shoshone had shaped their winter survival around thousands of seasons of observation. Wind patterns, snow behavior, the movement of heat through soil. Their shelters were not mere homes. They were responses to the land's logic. Jonathan remembered the elder's words from 2 nights ago. Your cabin fights the wind. Ours ask the earth for help. Now he understood those words in a way he hadn't before. Maria wiped her eyes. We need to help the others. Show them what you showed us. The elder nodded. Yes. The storm has passed, but another will come. Winter always gives more lessons. Jonathan looked back at the shelter they had built, half hidden in the hillside, snow embracing it instead of tearing at it. It looked almost alive, as if the mountain had grown a small, warm den for them. He whispered, We'd have died in that cabin. The elder answered softly, Many winters have taught us what your houses forgot. The wind shifted again, gentle, carrying the smell of pine bark warming under the morning light. The valley was beginning to wake. Dogs barked in the distance. A man called out for his wife. A door cracked open. The Harpers turned toward their neighbors, ready to help dig paths, share what they had learned, and guide others toward the shelter that had saved them. The elder lifted his gaze to the mountains. Winter teaches, but people must choose to remember. Late winter arrived like an exhale. The valley's white hush softened into running rivulets down sun-warmed rock. Snow that had once piled shoulder-high now clung in curtains and cornices. Inside the earthen shelter the fire had burned low, but comfort remained. The bermed walls still held a slow, honest warmth that the air could not steal. The Harpers woke not to panic, but to a small, luminous relief. The hard work of survival had become a practice worth keeping. The family stood in the low doorway and watched as neighbors emerged from buried cabins, blinking into the reflective light. Some walked toward the Harpers with tools and questions. Others stumbled, weak from cold and sleepless nights. Word moved quickly. The earth-bermed shelter, half hidden in the hillside, looked less like an oddity and more like a refuge that had been grown from the land itself. Jonathan remembered the elder's hands, steady, sure, and felt an obligation that had begun as gratitude and turned into responsibility. We can't keep this to ourselves, he said. If this saved us, it can save others. Maria nodded. They need to know how to build it. They need to know why. The elder listened, then smiled a small, weathered smile. Then teach them as we taught you. Teach them the measurements. Teach them the small truths. How soil holds heat, how low rooms keep it, how a short hearth feeds a family without wasting wood. He pointed to the packed floor and the low roof, to the packed burns that pressed the shelter into the hill. Teach them to listen. What followed was not a single sermon but a series of patient lessons. Over the next days, the Harpers and the elder walked each neighbor through the method. Where to choose a site, leeward slopes near sun openings but sheltered from crosswinds. How deep to dig, 2.5 feet for the floor. How thick to pack burns, 2-3 feet. And where to angle the entrance for a 6 to 8 foot tunnel that diminishes drafts. They demonstrated the low-angle roof, 10 to 20 degrees in, and the small hearth, 18 to 24-inch diameter, designed to radiate rather than consume. Neighbors watched the numbers with surprised reverence. A man in his 50s, his face lined from frost and worry, ran a hand over the earthen wall and said, This isn't just making a house. It's a whole different way of knowing snow. They learned how a packed snow layer, 6 to 12 inches deep on the roof, behaves like an insulator. How the earth beneath even retains temperatures around freezing rather than the bitter 30 degrees Celsius of the open air. And how cutting fuel use by 67% could mean more months of warmth across a long winter. In the weeks that followed, a few families built smaller earth berms, practical, fast, and suited to tight hands and thin supplies. Some used bark and reeds they already had. Some adapted the entrance to fit their barn tools. The specifics shifted with each household's needs, but the core principles persisted. Low is warm, earth is patient, and the mountain will hold what you ask if you listen. This local uptake was the beginning of a quieter legacy, one that would not be written in treaties or town records, but in the patterns of survival that spread across the ridge. It was a legacy of shared knowledge, indigenous survival methods teaching settlers a different physics of winter that their vertical houses had overlooked. The Shoshone methods were not romantic relics. They were rigorous, empirically tuned survival techniques refined by generations of observation and small, painful experiments. A year later, when the high pass winter returned in its usual mortal stubbornness, the community fared better. Fewer roofs failed, fewer families depleted their woodpiles to the point of desperation. Fires lasted longer because they had less demand to answer. Where once the American frontier had been a theater of loss against winter, it became a place where cross-cultural survival practice reduced suffering. The Harper's Choice, inspired by traditional skills, shifted the balance of risk in that valley. But there was also complexity. Some settlers resisted the idea, not out of ignorance alone, but because buildings also symbolize identity and permanence. A low, half-buried hut did not match the image of home many wanted to carry west. Others misapplied the lessons, building too shallow or using poor materials that trapped moisture and created damp problems. The elder and those who learned from him kept teaching. They refined the techniques, slight ventilation adjustments to avoid condensation, raised sleeping platforms, 18 to 24 inches off the floor to catch the warm pocket, and airflow measures to keep the flue from smoking. Modern comparison helps to clarify the genius in those traditional skills. A packed berm, 2-3 feet thick, effectively increases wall resistance to heat transfer far beyond a single log wall with gaps. A low-volume interior reduces convective heat loss. Raising sleeping platforms captures stratified warming. Small hearths, placed against earthen back walls, act as radiant heaters that the thermal mass slowly releases, turning brief combustion into hours of temperature moderation. Respectful treatment of indigenous knowledge demands more than acknowledging utility. It requires credit, context, and humility. The elders' methods were not tricks to be plucked. They were part of a lived system of place-based knowledge, seasonal cues, ecological relationships, and communal practices. Teaching, in this story, is reciprocal. It is a small ritual of gratitude. Jonathan set a plank against the berm entrance, writing on it with a charred stick, a simple mark to remember who had taught them. Not a claim, but a marker of learning. As the season closed, the elder prepared to move on. He left, not with possessions, but with the promise that the valley had shifted, a living, persistent proof that attentive listening to the land and to its oldest inhabitants changes outcomes. Before he departed, he placed both hands on Jonathan's shoulder and spoke the final reflection that would echo beyond the ridge. Some knowledge survives because it works. Some people survive because they learn. If the preservation of traditional skills and indigenous survival methods moved you, consider subscribing to Frontier Tales of America and tell us which forgotten technique you think should return to the American frontier.